Today's topic is rural electrification in Africa from a personal viewpoint. Hello, everyone. Good to be with you once again. Today, I have with me Sten Bergman, an engineer from Sweden who was selected by the World Bank to work on rural electrification in Africa. And I want to mention that Sweden generously supported that effort, and Sten joined our World Bank team sponsored by Sweden. He will tell you all about himself and what he did in Africa. So over to you, Sten.
Yeah, thank you very much. We are talking about a time when I entered the bank in 1999. And before that, I have done a lot of things in the energy business. I started up nuclear power plants in the 70s. I worked with wind power for a number of years. I was an electrical engineer at ABB for a while, research manager. I was in Japan as a diplomat for a few years. And I came to be an R&D manager for the Swedish utilities. So before coming into the bank, I had been working a lot with research, development, and also with practical issues around dealing with electric distributions matters. And my first job in the bank was to work and to see how we could expand electrification in some rural countries. This was a program that I think it was started by Mr. Wolfenson, the president himself, a few years before, and it was strongly supported by the Swedish and the Nordic donors, and possibly also the Netherlands. I came to the bank as an engineer to look at the electrical and distributional matters, but it showed up that after a few years working on rural development, the problem was not really technical. We had to deal with a lot of other problems. And this is what I'm going to speak about for the next 10-15 minutes. My learning from the Africa Rural and Renewable Energy Initiative, where Subodh and other colleagues, I think we were a group of maybe 10 to 10 people, were working for 3-4 years in Africa. So my first point is, what was the situation we came into in the early 99? And what was the thing we achieved during 3-4 years in Africa? And then what was my learning? I continued to work in Africa for another 10 years, so to say, but that was partly for the World Bank, but mostly with SIDA, as a consultant to SIDA. And when coming back from the World Bank, I started my own consultant company, and that's what I'm doing still, working with consulting matters in renewable issues, electric cars, and so on. So bringing back into the 1999 issue, what was the situation in Africa? Well, we knew from the beginning that it was a big problem of electrifying rural areas because two problems. They were far away from the national grid. They were rather small. They were maybe 100 people or 1,000 people. And we are talking about distances up to 100, 200 kilometers away from the grids. So the role was actually to find out methods to electrify. And this has been done over the years, but typically by the national utilities in many African countries. And African utilities are not different to European or US utilities. They look at the cost issue. Is it too costly? Why should I do it? If it's good economy, I can do it. So our goal setting was in the very beginning that we should electrify for 1/10 of the cost, but 10 times faster what is done at that time. So it was quite an impressive goal setting. Could it be done that way? So we started to look into a few countries. We had a team and we went, I think first mission was to Mozambique. Mozambique at that time was in a really big trouble. There had been war for many years. It was very poor. They had very low electrification rates in the rural areas. But it was also, they were also affected by a lot of other problems of malaria and typhoons and whatever came into the country. But we started there to understand how we should go ahead with the program. Our program was not really defined in the beginning, so we had to figure out what we should do. That was the first thing. And quite soon we realized that we had to divide the role of the government from rural electrification and form a new entity. We call them rural agencies that should not be hijacked by the ministers and by the bureaucrats in the main cities. This was more to figure out also, could we find financing mechanisms for it? Should there be some funds developed for this, and where should the money come for this fund? So it was a lot of questions about organizational structures, and it was about how to mobilize a country for changing its custom rules for electrification, and also work with the people in utilities and on the ground as a pure educational issue. Because we were talking about electrification and they had a very different picture of what that was. Most people saw electrification as there was a pole and there were 3 wires coming over the land, and that was it. It was very high power need. And we figured out also from meeting with a lot of local people that the need was enormous. And the cost issue was not really the problem, because people paid almost too much for the electricity they had. They had generators, they had kerosene, they had bulbs and whatever. They produced their own local electricity at a very high cost. So giving them a little better option and connecting them to the main grids, that would have saved them a lot of money. But we had also to fight with the donors and with the bank, with the perception that we were working in poor countries. And finding out that the poor countries was not only to go out and give them electricity for lighting up their village, because that will not generate money for them. That was only lighting up the poverty of them. So we were looking for productive use of electricity. And this was the critical issue, that we had to find key anchor customers that were key to our program. Were they such people? Were they such organizations? And can we bring together a number of them so we had a breakthrough, let's say a cost breakthrough? Because then it was simple to argue about the rest, the poorest part, because they will actually get it for free then. The sunken costs were taken by the productive users. This was an issue that was very much about a social issue on ground. Could people pay? Were they willing? What will be the organization? Who should be operating these utilities? Should there be new entities, or should it be actually the traditional electricity generator? So we hadn't figured out all these questions from beforehand.
Okay,
we learned that we were.
Let me just summarize what you are saying. What you are saying is that we had to rethink everything. It was a completely different way. The old way was not working and it would not work. So you had to have a new technology, a new agency, a new way to understand the people's needs, and a new motivation. So that's why it needed a team, because we had to look at it from all the aspects. Is that what you are saying?
Yeah, exactly. We had to look at the problem from various angles. And then it actually dealt very much about how to change the condition for people in rural areas using electricity. It was not just to come out with some solar panels or whatever, because that didn't change the situation. But productive use was the key to many of these projects we rather favored to work with. And we looked into the statistics that we had at that time. And that was that electrification on the rural villages was very high cost. People had used standards, what I say, normal standards that we apply in US and Europe, but also in Africa. And this was ridiculous because these standards were for very, very high dense electric use areas. The cost was something like $20,000 to $30,000 a kilometer to build a line. And the line itself, the power line, should withstand ice loads because that was the normal standard in Europe. But there was seldom any ice in Africa. So these standards was, so to say, they were European but not African. We tried to change the concept a little bit. We saw that why should we come there with a lot of three-phase loads, power lines, when there were no loads for three-phase? There were just single motors, there were lighting, there were refrigerators and so on, but nothing used really three-phase power. This was very hard to convince the local governments, even the national governments, because they saw electricity as a three-phase system, very high-powered. So our inventions, or what we tried to invent, was to make it simpler and more cost-effective. So we started to talk about low-cost electrification, but rather soon we understood that this was not the right word because that had a flavor of poor quality in it. So low cost, we couldn't use the word low cost anymore. So we changed it into cost-effective electrification, because that was more appropriate to say. But what we meant was that why should it cost $20,000 when it could actually cost $2,000?
Right.
The second problem was that we tried to use best practice from other countries outside of Africa, from New Zealand, Australia, US, and also Europe. And that was to come out with, for example, one-phase system, single wire earth return system, which has been used and demonstrated since the 30s. But everywhere people said, no, we can't use this because we don't trust this technology. We could deliver, for example, a 400 or 500 kilowatt, 100 kilometers out at a cost of 1/10 of what it normally costs. But we didn't get any buying into this single wire technology. Not even though we had a lot of people flying in from all these countries and showing examples and giving their perspective on what should be done. There was not really such a good ground for coming with these kind of new technologies, that they called new technologies. This was also a problem not only from the utilities we worked with or from the government. It was also a problem from the bank and the donors, because they could easily see that this is a very low-cost situation, and they wanted to deliver much money. So how can we do this? We can't get much money when it's so cheap. So in that case, it has to be a very large scale of it. But we didn't have the scale either. We had a very small village. And that was a little bit frustrating, as we had to work with contradictory goals, contradictory in different parts. Not only that we had to solve the social dilemma, but also the technical dilemma. And we also figured out a lot of problems that were behind the situation as it was. One was, of course, that there was a big form of corruption. Corruption was going on everywhere. And one of the easiest way to figure out the corruption, that was to study where the costs came from. We had a work in Mozambique, as I told you in the beginning. Later on, a few years later, we worked in Swaziland. In Swaziland, they produced poles, very good poles, high quality poles. And they sold these poles for about $100 each. That was a reasonable price for a good pole. But they didn't want to sell these poles into Mozambique, as they claimed that once the pole went over the border, the cost of the pole was 10 times higher. It was $2,000. And someone took that difference. And that was typically the utilities or other people. we couldn't figure out exactly where the money came from and where the cost increase came from. Another issue was when we in Uganda also studied why modern poles deteriorated and fell down after 1 year of operation. And that was because they were not treated at all. They were just untreated poles put up in the grounds. So we started to analyze the situation even there. 3-4 factories were analyzed. But after a few weeks, the local consultant came and said, Mr. Bergman, I cannot do this because I'm threatened to life. I can't ask questions about this because these utilities were owned by rich people in the country. And they threatened these guys. So we couldn't figure out it into detail what was going on. But it's obvious was some kind of corruption. So when we tried to work and when I tried to get out modern technology, we looked into simpler way to do it that was not easy to steal. And one of that system was actually to come with cables, put up a cable in the ground and fill it up easily. No one actually goes out and dig up a big cable for a few kilometers, especially if they can't sell it. But then we had to deliver a lot of arguments why cables was better than power lines. And they were, but when they were also less costly and more reliable, etc., etc. But this issue was actually relating to something very old. They have tried it maybe 20, 30 years back, and they know cables were extremely expensive at that time. And that was because they contained copper. But modern cables don't have copper, they have aluminium, but it was very hard to convince. So my learning from the first years in the bank was that we must overcome these hurdles of let's say, knowledge, which is about education. Education, I think, is the key issue of development. Once people had to understand what was going on, it was simple. But if we have to argue too much, we had to fight for many years to come through. I come to work later on, a few years after the World Bank, as a consultant in Zambia to help one of the rural agencies and develop their skill. And it took about 1 or 2 years to develop the skill of really skilled people from the very beginning, but to think in different ways. This is my first learning was actually that the methods used were not appropriate. Technology was not appropriate, but the methods were also not appropriate because they used modern standards. And modern standards, I mean standards that were developed in the 1930s, 1940s. They were called modern standards. And that was about how to look at the need for power versus the need of energy. So there is a formula people usually adapt when they calculate what kind of system shall I build. They look at the energy need and then they recalculate what is the maximum power needed for this house or village or whatever. And there's a formula from a man called Welander. Welander's formula had been used in Europe since the 30s. But when applying that formula in Africa, everything got wrong because the households in Africa, they were not that type of loads. They were very simple loads. Typically, they needed maybe a stove, maybe some lighting with refrigerator, but they were not big machinery, nothing that. So the Welander formula was wrong. It was very hard to convince people to change it. What we did in the end of the third year, I think, is to develop another model, a bottom-up type of load calculator. So once we knew how a hut used its energy and we could combine different type of loads, we could recalculate the power profile. So we could see what is the peak power needed. And that differed many times from the Welander formula. So, and that could have generated low cost electrification over maybe 20, 30 years, for example, until maybe the load has grown so that the formula was applicable. I came into work with some of the universities in Africa. Typically in Tanzania, I worked with the Tanzania Dar es Salaam Technical University, DTU. And that was also very interesting because they were development interested. And they made a lot of studies. They went out in Tanzania and studied to get a lot of data from everywhere. They figured out a lot of information. So taking that information and going to the utility, Tanzania, TANESCO, and asking what they thought about it. They took out in their shelf, they had a lot of projects they have actually never done, and they have been sitting there for maybe 10, 15 years. And we figured out that their data was old and outdated. Nothing was actually true. This was also the same in Zambia, where we came to a village which is supposed to have about 2,000 connection. But that connection was not anymore, there was no connection at all, it was zero connection in that village, because that village was actually built during the, I think about the 60s, when there was some military from Namibia working there. It's a training camp. They were not there anymore. So we had wrong data. And that was my learning from this 3 years of the bank. The ministries in Africa should have known better because they were sitting on all the data. Consultants came from the bank, from different banks, from donors. They all made surveys, they all screened the situation. But once there was a new project, every project should start from scratch. We should figure out ourselves. This data were not really matured, so we had to figure out ourselves. And sometimes this gave very funny results. Let me just give an example from Tanzania. In the very last year, I worked for one project. I had two projects in Tanzania that was developed during the World Bank period, but I got project managing this later on. One was in the Vino ward in the south, and one was in the north in a little town called Kasulu.
Yes.
Both places had around 1,000 people. Kasulu was a town, very limited town, no electricity. Vino ward was 10 villages along a ridge. There were about 100 people in each village. Kasulu had nothing around it, very little hydro, very little solar, of course, but not much more. While in the south, there were 7 rivers, small rivers, one big and 7 small rivers. So we figured out that could we use something of the existing power generation in these places? Up in Kasulu, if you can show 2 pictures, I have 2 pictures from Kasulu. If you show them, I can speak to them.
Yeah, there. Can you see it?
Yeah. This is a typical situation of my working day, interviewing people, making notes, and meeting with the local chiefs or also representatives from the government or even the village representatives. So data collection was the key for understanding what was happening. The second picture, if you show that.
Yes.
The second picture is actually one of the best biogas plants I ever seen. It was a local professor I think it was from Dar es Salaam. He made a biogas digester, and it was built very rapidly. For example, in 3-4 weeks, it was built. And that biogas digester could use 4 cows to produce methane gas. And that methane gas can be put into a normal diesel generator, and it can operate a full school with hundreds of students, and they could have a computer education. This was up in Kasulu. But when asking the donor to finance that project that could generate they said 10 such biogas plants could have electrified the whole Kasulo town at that time for the productive use and also some lighting. But then this project was actually turned down because first issue was it was too cheap. It didn't require so much money. It was built by the local people and it was producing electricity very, very cheap. So what we needed was to have 100 coals and to build 10 of those. But it was turned down. But it was turned down not on the right reason, it was turned down on the wrong reason. Because the donor said, no, we cannot have this because of the risk of hepatitis B. Hepatitis B is not coming from animals, they're coming from people, men. But anyhow, they actually disclosed that project. The other project I worked for in South, I worked for 2 years with that. And that was a small river called Limkerenge. Limkerenge River was actually a run-of-river project that could have supplied these 10 villages with 24-hour electricity all the year
Let
round.
me stop you there. Run of the river means you use the river water without making a dam. You let the river water flow, and yet you are able to generate electricity. Most people are used to the idea of dams and so on. Run of the river means you don't put any dam. You use the water as it is flowing by so that you don't disturb the river. So sorry to interrupt, Sten, but I think people need to know it, right?
Run of the river, that was it. We could actually put in 3 or 4 small hydro generators in that river and produce 24-hour electricity all the year. But then I happened to come into discussion with the local environmental ministry that had to go there and figure out if that was true. And they said, no, we need 1 year of data. And the project could not afford 1 year of data collection. So I went out there and talked with the local farmer. I said, if you go out here to the river every day, 3 times a day, and you measure the flow and the amount of flow, and you measure the rain comes, and you do that, and then you go up to the village where we have put into actually internet over radio link. That was one of the first internet link in Africa. Bush link was the called. And then you send the data once a month to me, and I pay you $1 a day. So when I came back to Africa and met him, he got $1 a day for what he worked. He was very happy. And I took the money out of my pocket money because there was no budget for it. But after 1 year, I had the data needed. And then I sent out the ministry to look. They had to go there 3 times to look at the river. And they had to go there because they had a very high per diem per day to come out.
Yes.
The last meeting, I said, no, you have to make a decision. No, you cannot do it. We cannot allow you to destroy the nature, I said. You're destroying the nature. At that time, when the project was about to fail, I asked the people in that village, but you have a big river here. Yeah, there's a big river here, but it's far away, they said, very far away. But say, let's go there. I said, let's go to these far away rivers. We can look at it. It happens to be so that this far away was actually going in a circle. It was very long circumference of that. So we came to the river, and that was about 6 kilometers from the village. It's not this 30, 40 that is said. So actually, that had been a much better option, the big river. So even I was cheated, so to say, of not having understood what long meant in Africa. This was a long travel, but it was not a long distance. So we had a lot of, so to say, cultural things to overcome, to understand. And when I figured out that we had a big hydro in that river, but it was owned and operated by the nuns. It was built by the Spanish donor and it was run by nuns. And I said, why don't we use this? We could use it for a stone crusher, we could use it for the village. But they said, no, we are not allowing anyone to use our electricity. Even if we don't use it, it's ours. So it happened then that I had to make a deal with the Archbishop. And the Archbishop, he was very interested in this project because he used it for his re-election. There were two archbishops in Tanzania, one in north and one in south, and they had to be re-elected every 5th year or so. So he said that all information about this project shall go through me. So actually this project took a long time to go because it was sent through this archbishop. And he was actually affected by malaria, so he was out of, you couldn't talk with him for 2-3 months sometimes. So it was very problematic to run a project where so many people were involved and where the donor thought it was a risky project when it was not risky. It was actually, this project was very smart because we had already got all the money from the local people put into a fund. They had also bought in their own, built their own cooperative. That was done. So it was not a discussion of building it, it was actually built. So the money we got from that, actually, it was secured and placed in the Swedish embassy for a couple of years until it has to be paid back. So after a few years of running that project, which actually failed because of a number of reasons, it would have costed maybe, I think, $6 million. $6 million. What's a small project? 1,000 people could have been electrified in 2005. The Swedish donor came out and said, oh, we are going to electrify this area. So now the government has been given 600 million Swedish kronor, $60 million in a grant. But it will take them 15 years to come out. So right now they have got electricity, but it took them 15 years more. So these are examples on where I think where there are not synchronous between donors, financiers, utilities, etc. Even if the private sector is on top of many things, we had to overcome all these small, what we think small issues in the beginning. But in the very end, they were not so small. They were actually big hurdles. For example, this environmental institute in Tanzania was supported by SIDA also. And it took a long time to discuss with them where the role was. They haven't really figured out the role. Even if they got a lot of work, they said no to all kind of environmental friendly technologies.
Yeah, okay, Sten, I think we understand that it's very tough to get results in Africa, no matter how hard you work, no matter how much backing you have, innovation.
Yeah.
I mean, there are difficulties all over. So it's just a lesson, I think, that everybody should understand that on the ground results in Africa are not easy because there are so many variables and so many factors. And even if you work very hard, you don't know what the next issue will be. It's very hard to define the problem. Actually, you keep coming up with new issues. I mean, who would think you have to go through the Archbishop to get electricity? But that's the reality. I think I think we should end here, unless you have something special to
No, I just will give you 3 points. That is my summary of what I'm.
Yeah.
First, the result of our work was actually that a number of rural energy agencies was built and constructed.
Yes.
In many countries, countries. And now you can see after 15 years here that there is a Pan-African cooperation among these rural agencies. So that have happened the last 5 years.
Yes.
What we can understand still, I think the number of connections per year is still under the number of people born.
Yes.
So there is a big increasing gap.
Yes.
Yeah. And the third is that even we thought we had new technology when we were out. But if we look now, it's even more modern, even more smarter, even cheaper. So now technology has come into the right cost level for doing this, what we tried to do 20 years back.
Right.
So my learning is that education is needed everywhere. We need to educate people everywhere, every place. Local initiatives that we saw, they need also strong support. Local initiatives can do things. we should have had from the very beginning a buy-in about demonstrators. We didn't, we were fighting to get demonstrators up and running. And that took a lot of time. And also we saw the importance of the coordination among the different entities in the countries. I think we worked a lot to coordinate among the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Water, and whatsoever.
Right.
So I think when we had made our first efforts there, I think there's still a lot of issues up and running.
Yeah.
But technology-wise, I think it were in much better shape today.
Yes, I think so. In another video, I will discuss the financing issues of if you want the private sector to do it, what are the financing issues. But Sten was going to talk to us about the technical issues. And that's really great. I mean, you have made it clear that getting results in Africa is a very tough business. It's not something that you can just go in with a new technology or a new approach and lots of money and get results. It doesn't work that way at all. It's tough business. Anyway, Sten, thank you so much for taking the time to tell us and, build on your experience around the world. I think it's very useful. So let me say bye to the viewers. And okay, so everybody, thank you for being with us and bye.
Thank you.